A mountain man finds a tunnel on his land after an earthquake, but what he discovered inside shocked the nation. Lantern light flickers over old crates. A rusted lock snaps. Inside, ancient belts, broken crosses, and government seals hidden in the dark. He thought it was just forgotten treasure, until he realized these papers could return a stolen river to a forgotten people. Church bell tolls. Hooves thunder. A shadowy figure in a black coat spits his cigar to the dirt. But powerful men will kill to keep the truth buried. Hired guns in the night, fire in the church, and a father, long estranged from his son, torn between fear and faith. The tunnel groans, collapsing. A woman's voice whispers in prayer. Rifle bolts click in the dark. What happens when one man's discovery can change the fate of an entire nation? And how far will greed go to silence the truth? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Ezekiel Boone stepped out onto his front porch, coffee cup warming his weathered hands. The spring air held that particular mountain chill that made a man grateful for hot coffee and sturdy boots. His gaze drifted to the broken fence line where his neighbor's steer had pushed through 2 days prior.
Might as well get to it.
Setting down his up and retrieving his tools from the lean-to. The steady rhythm of hammering fence posts brought comfort to his solitary morning. Ezekiel had grown used to quiet days since Sarah passed, though the ache of loneliness never truly left him. His son James hadn't visited in 3 years. Their relationship as broken as the fence he now mended. The first tremor came subtle like a vibration he felt more in his boots than heard. Then the ground bucked hard, nearly throwing him off his feet. His hammer clattered against stone as he stumbled, catching himself on a fence post. The violent shaking intensified and a sound like thunder rolled through the valley. Lord have mercy, he breathed, watching his cabin dance and shudder. The window panes rattled in their frames, and from inside came the crash of breaking dishes. In the barn, his old mule Pedro brayed in terror, the sound sharp with panic. After what felt like minutes but couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, the shaking subsided. Dust hung thick in the air, and somewhere in the distance, a rock slide rumbled down the mountainside. Ezekiel's heart hammered in his chest as he surveyed the damage. His cabin stood intact, though the chimney had shed some stones. But what caught his eye was the fresh crack that had opened in the earth near the ridge, maybe 50 yards from where he stood. It ran like a jagged wound across his pasture, disappearing into the scrub oak beyond. Drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, Ezekiel followed the fisher's path. The crack widened as it approached the ridge, opening into a dark maw large enough for a man to enter. He hesitated at the edge, peering down into the darkness. "Ain't natural," he murmured, but curiosity got the better of caution. "Best fetch a light." He returned with his barn lantern and a length of rope. The entrance was tight but passable, requiring him to turn sideways and shuffle through. The walls were surprisingly smooth, almost worked-looking, and as he pressed deeper, he found himself in a timbered shaft that couldn't be natural. The air hung heavy with age and decay, thick with the musty smell of rotting wood. His lantern cast dancing shadows on walls supported by ancient beams, some bowed with the weight of earth above. The tunnel ran straight into the ridge, its floor worn smooth by what must have been years of use. "Someone dug this proper," he said aloud, his voice oddly muffled in the close space. "Question is who? And why?" 20 yards in, the tunnel widened into a roughly circular chamber. Ezekiel raised his lantern, and its light fell across stacked wooden crates, each carefully wrapped in oilcloth that had gone gray with age and dust. The preservation spoke of purpose. These weren't abandoned mining supplies. With trembling fingers, he lifted the edge of a rotted cloth. The crate beneath was solid, its wood still strong despite the years. The lid came away with a protesting creak, and Ezekiel caught his breath at what lay within. Delicate beadwork caught the lantern light. Patterns worked in blues and whites that told stories he couldn't read but recognized as Apache craftsmanship. Beside the beaded pieces lay silver crosses, their surfaces tarnished but still beautiful. mixing Christian and native designs in a way he'd never seen. Beneath these treasures, he found leather portfolios tied with faded ribbon, their covers stamped with government seals he recognized from his time-working survey cruise. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, carefully lifting one of the portfolios. Inside, the papers were still legible, though age had yellowed their edges. His eyes caught phrases that made his heart skip. "Treaty of peace and friendship, lands hereby designated, rights of passage guaranteed." Ezekiel sank to his haunches, the weight of his discovery settling over him like a physical thing. These weren't just artifacts. These were proof. Proof of promises made and broken, of agreements hidden away in this dark place where they couldn't be honored or enforced. The lantern light seemed to dim as the implications grew clearer. The nearest Apache reservation lay 50 miles south, its people confined to land no settler had wanted. But these papers, these spoke of other boundaries, other agreements. The beadwork and crosses weren't just art, they were heritage stolen and hidden. As the day's light began to fade outside, Ezekiel carefully replaced the items and secured the crate. His mind raced with the weight of his choice. To stay quiet would be easier, safer even. But the truth of what lay in this tunnel could change everything for the Apache people who'd been moved off their ancestral lands. The moral burden settled heavy on his shoulders as he made his way back to the tunnel's entrance. The truth had quite literally been shaken loose, and now he had to decide what to do with it. As he emerged into the gathering dusk, coyotes called from the ridge, their songs carrying across the valley like questions without answers. Inside his cabin, Ezekiel lit the lamps and swept up the broken dishes, but his mind stayed fixed on what lay hidden in the earth. The earthquake had done more than crack the ground. It had unearthed secrets that some had worked hard to bury. As night settled over his homestead, he knew sleep would be long in coming. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds as Ezekiel made his way back to the tunnel entrance. The morning dew dampened his boots, and meadowlarks called from the fence posts he'd mended yesterday. He carried his lantern, a canteen, and a small leather satchel, planning to examine his discovery more carefully in the light of day. The crack in the earth gaped like an open wound against the landscape. Ezekiel paused at its mouth, offering a quick prayer before lowering himself inside. The descent felt easier in the morning light that filtered through the entrance, though darkness soon swallowed him as he moved deeper into the passage. The chamber where he'd found the crate stood exactly as he'd left it. Ezekiel set his lantern on a fallen timber and pulled out the leather portfolio he'd examined briefly the day before. His hands trembled slightly as he untied the faded ribbon binding it. "Let's see what secrets you're holding," he murmured, carefully unfolding the first document. The parchment crackled beneath his fingers, but the ink remained clear despite its age. Official letterhead marked the top of the page, and Ezekiel's breath caught as he read the opening lines. "Treaty of peace and friendship between the United States of America and the Apache Nation, established and confirmed this 15th day of March, 1867. Below the formal text stretched 2 columns of signatures. On one side, the flowing script of Army officers, colonels and generals whose names he recognized from old newspapers. On the other, the marks and translated names of Apache leaders. Red wax seals, though cracked with age, still clung to the bottom of the document, bearing the official stamp of the United States government. Ezekiel's hands shook harder as he read through the terms. The treaty laid out clear boundaries for Apache territories, including explicit rights to water sources that fed the entire region. "The very same water that now Sarah," he whispered, memories flooding back. His late wife had often spoken of missing documents, papers that could have prevented the forced relocations, the conflicts that had cost so many lives on both sides. She'd worked as a translator during the peace talks, believing in the possibility of justice until the end. "You knew about these, didn't you?" He touched the paper gently. "You knew they existed somewhere." The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like the mountain above. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were legal documents that could change everything. But who could he trust with this information? The local authorities were deep in the railroad's pocket, and the Indian agent at the reservation was known more for lining his own pockets than helping those in his care. Ezekiel sank down onto a crate, bowed his head, and did something he hadn't done aloud since Sarah's passing. He prayed. "Lord, I ain't always been the best at knowing your will," his voice rough with emotion, "but I reckon you didn't shake these papers loose for no reason. Give me wisdom, Father. Show me the right path." After securing everything exactly as he'd found it, Ezekiel emerged from the tunnel. He needed supplies from town, and sitting alone with his thoughts wouldn't make his choices any clearer. The 2-hour ride to Crystal Creek usually helped clear his mind, but today his thoughts churned like spring floodwaters. The main street was busy when he arrived, townsfolk moving between the general store, the telegraph office, and the newly established bank. Inside Whitaker's general store, Ezekiel gathered his usual supplies: flour, coffee, nails for his endless fence repairs. He was counting out change when a familiar voice carried through the open door, making his stomach clench. Silas Thorne stood on the wooden sidewalk outside, holding court with several well-dressed men. The railroad baron cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his silver watch chain glinting in the morning sun. His voice carried clearly through the store's front window. "The dam will transform this whole region, gentlemen. We'll control the water flow from the mountains clear down to the territorial line. The railroad needs that water for the new spur, and I mean to see it built." Ezekiel's fingers tightened around the coins in his hand. The dam Thorne spoke of would be built on the exact river mentioned in the treaty, water that legally belonged to the Apache people. His discovery in the tunnel wasn't just history, it was about to become the center of a very present conflict. "That'll be $1.45, Mr. Boone," old Tom Whitaker said, pulling Ezekiel from his thoughts. "Much obliged, Tom." Ezekiel paid and gathered his supplies, careful to keep his face neutral as he stepped outside. He couldn't help glancing at Thorne's group. The railroad baron caught his eye and nodded slightly, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Boone. Don't see you in town much these days." "Mr. Thorne." Ezekiel touched the brim of his hat, the gesture automatic but stiff. "Got what I need. Heading back now." He felt Thorne's gaze on his back as he loaded his saddlebags. Something in that calculating look made him check his back trail as he rode home, and his caution proved warranted. About an hour out of town, he spotted 2 riders following at a distance. They were good, hanging back just far enough to claim they were simply traveling the same road. But Ezekiel hadn't survived decades in the mountains by being foolish. He led them on a winding path through the foothills, finally losing them in a series of narrow draws he knew better than his own cabin. The sun was low by the time he reached home, painting the mountains in deep purple shadows. Inside his cabin, Ezekiel pried up the loose floorboard beneath his bed, a hiding spot Sarah had once used for her precious books. He wrapped the treaty he'd taken from the tunnel in oilcloth and tucked it safely away. The cabin felt especially empty as night settled in. Ezekiel lit his lantern but kept the flame low, not wanting its light visible through the windows. In the gentle glow, he could almost imagine Sarah sitting in her rocking chair mending by the fire. She'd believed so strongly in justice, in doing right no matter the cost. "I mean to honor that, Sarah," he whispered into the quiet room. "Whatever comes of it, I aim to see truth brought to light." Outside, an owl called into the gathering dark. Ezekiel checked his rifle was loaded before settling into his chair for what promised to be a long night of watchful waiting. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of amber and rose as Ezekiel saddled his horse. The sturdy bay mare stood patient while he checked the cinch, her ears flicking at the familiar sounds of leather creaking and metal buckles clicking. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with the weight of his discovery. The morning air held a crisp bite as he guided his horse down the narrow trail toward the reservation agency. Patches of late summer wildflowers dotted the slopes, their colors bright against the dry grass. His plan was simple enough. Speak with the agency clerk. Feel out whether the man could be trusted with what he'd found. The mare's hooves clicked steadily against stone as they rounded a bend in the trail. Ahead, a slight figure crouched among clusters of sagebrush, dark hair falling forward to shield her face. She looked up sharply at his approach, one hand moving to the knife at her belt. Ezekiel reined his horse to a gentle stop, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He recognized her now. The Apache widow, who sometimes traded herbs with the town's doctor. What was her name? Nayeli. That was it. "Morning, ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "Don't mean to startle you." She straightened, sage leaves clutched in one hand, her dark eyes studying him with careful wariness. Her simple dress was clean but worn, showing signs of careful mending. A leather pouch hung at her waist, half filled with gathered plants. "Mr. Boone," she replied in clear English, her voice low and measured, "you're far from your homestead." "Heading to the agency." He hesitated, then made a decision. Something in her steady gaze spoke of strength and wisdom beyond her years. "Truth is, I found something that might interest your people." Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the sage leaves. "The white man's agency has never held anything good for my people." "This is different." Ezekiel swung down from his horse, moving slowly. "Yesterday morning, an earthquake opened up an old tunnel on my land. Inside, I found—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I found things that were hidden. Important things." "What things?" Her voice was sharp now, though she hadn't moved. Instead of answering directly, Ezekiel reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle. His hands were gentle as he folded back the cloth, revealing the beaded belt he'd brought as proof. Nayeli's breath caught audibly. She took one step forward, then another, her eyes fixed on the intricate beadwork. The morning light caught the careful patterns of blue and white, the leather still supple despite its age. "May I?" she whispered. Ezekiel held it out to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it, fingers tracing the designs with shocking tenderness. "This belonged to Standing Bear," she said softly. "My husband's grandfather. He was a chief among our people." Her eyes lifted to Ezekiel's face, suddenly fierce. "Where did you find this?" "It was lost many years ago when the soldiers came. In that tunnel I mentioned, there's more ceremonial items, documents, treaties that were supposed to protect your people's rights to water and land." He watched her carefully. "Treaties that were never honored." Nayeli's fingers still moved over the beadwork, but her mind was clearly racing. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I aim to see justice done, but I need help knowing who to trust. I was heading to speak with Clark at the agency." "No." The sharpness of her tone made his horse stamp nervously. Nayeli lowered her voice. "Clark works for the railroad men. He takes their money to look the other way while they steal more of our water, more of our land." She held the belt out to him. "If you truly want to help, do not trust him." Ezekiel took the belt back, rewrapping it carefully. "Then help me understand these documents. Some have marks I can't read, Apache signs and symbols." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. "You live alone, yes? No family?" "Just me and the horses." "I will come to your cabin tonight after sunset. We can examine what you found then, away from watching eyes." She glanced toward the trail. "The railroad men have spies everywhere." "I noticed some followers yesterday," Ezekiel admitted. "Lost them in the draws near Elk Creek." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Then perhaps you're not entirely foolish." She gathered her herb pouch closer. "Cook enough beans for 2. I will bring fresh bread." The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when Ezekiel heard soft footsteps outside his cabin. He'd spent the afternoon hauling water, chopping wood, and trying not to watch the trail too obviously. The beans simmered in their pot, filling the small space with a homey smell that reminded him of better days. A gentle knock sounded and he opened the door to find Nayeli standing in the growing dusk. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and moved with the silent grace he'd noticed that morning. Inside, she settled at his rough-hewn table while he poured them both cups of coffee. "Show me what you found," she said simply. Ezekiel retrieved the documents from beneath the floorboard, along with several of the smaller artifacts he'd brought up from the tunnel. He spread them carefully on the table while Nayeli lit the second lamp he'd set out. Her fingers moved reverently over each item: a medicine pouch, a carved pipe, strings of shell beads that had once belonged to a chief's daughter. But it was the treaties that held her attention longest. She bent over them in the lamplight, translating the Apache marks and symbols that had been added alongside the English text. "This is Red Cloud's mark," she said, pointing to one intricate design. "And here, this shows Standing Bear's dream of the eagle. It was his way of signing important documents." She looked up at Ezekiel, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "These are real. These prove that the water rights were granted to us legally, that the land was meant to stay in our hands." "Reckon that's why they were hidden away," Ezekiel said quietly. "Powerful men wanted these documents to disappear. And now they have come to light." Nayeli sat back, her hands folded in her lap. "But what can be done? The courts do not listen to our people. The agents ignore our complaints." "I've been thinking on that." Ezekiel poured more coffee for them both. "These papers have government seals. They're legal documents. If we could get them to someone honest in the territorial capital—" "It would be dangerous," she said. "The railroad men would not want these papers found. They would try to stop anyone carrying them." I'm willing to take that risk. The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, but Ezekiel knew they were true. My wife, she believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. She'd want me to help. Nayeli was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the lamplight. Finally, she nodded. Then we will help each other. I can show you safe trails through the mountains, paths the railroad men don't know, and I can speak to the elders, gather support among my people. Something warm bloomed in Ezekiel's chest. Hope, he realized. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake, truly part of something larger than his solitary existence. They talked long into the evening, making plans, sharing knowledge, building trust over coffee and beans and Nayeli's fresh bread. When she finally rose to leave, the moon was high over the mountains. Ezekiel walked her to the door, watching as she melted into the shadows like a spirit. But she was no spirit. She was flesh and blood, strength and wisdom, a partner in this quest for justice that had fallen into his hands. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking up at the stars. "Well, Sarah," he whispered, "reckon you'd be proud of this." The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint cry of a distant coyote. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Ezekiel felt more certain of his path than he had in years. 2 days later, the morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Ezekiel guided his horse between the weathered buildings of town. Dust kicked up beneath his mount's hooves, settling on his worn boots and the hem of his coat. He'd chosen his best shirt for this visit, though it was far from new, and made sure his beard was neatly trimmed. The white-painted church stood sentinel at the edge of town, its modest steeple reaching toward the clear Colorado sky. Reverend Carter's mare dozed in the shade beside the building, confirming the preacher was inside. Ezekiel tied his horse next to hers, patting her neck as she nickered a greeting. Nayeli's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful who you trust. But if anyone in town had both wisdom and integrity, it was Reverend Carter. The man had been serving this community for 15 years, riding circuit through the valleys to reach scattered homesteads and settlements. The church door creaked as Ezekiel entered. Reverend Carter looked up from his Bible, reading glasses perched on his nose. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, painting colored patterns across the wooden pews. Ezekiel Boone, the preacher smiled, rising from his desk. It's been a while since I've seen you at services. Been keeping to myself too much, I reckon. Ezekiel removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Need your counsel on something important, Reverend. Something that could affect a lot of folks around here. Carter gestured to a pew. Sit down, my friend. Tell me what's troubling you. Ezekiel settled onto the smooth wood, the familiar smell of beeswax and hymnal pages bringing back memories of sitting here with Sarah years ago. He began carefully, describing the earthquake, the discovery of the tunnel, and finally the documents that proved Apache rights to water and land. The preacher listened intently, his weathered face growing serious. When Ezekiel finished, Carter removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully with a handkerchief. These are dangerous waters you're wading into, he said finally. Silas Thorne has a lot of influence in these parts. Men who've crossed him tend to face difficulties. I know it. Ezekiel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But these papers are legal documents, signed and sealed proper. They prove promises were made and broken. Ain't right to ignore that. Carter nodded slowly. No, it isn't right, and God's justice doesn't bow to railroad money. He replaced his glasses, looking at Ezekiel directly. Have you considered taking this to Judge Albright? He's known for being fair-minded even when it costs him. Would he stand up to Thorne? He's done it before, though it's gotten harder lately. Railroad's been putting pressure on him, threatening to move their business elsewhere. Carter sighed. But he's still our best hope for handling this legally and properly. Baraber Gabrailer. Ezekiel stood, settling his hat back on his head. Much obliged for the counsel, Reverend. I'll think on it. I'll pray for wisdom for us all, Carter said, walking him to the door. And Ezekiel? Be careful. Some men value profit over truth. The ride home took longer than usual as Ezekiel pondered the preacher's words. The sun was setting by the time he approached his cabin, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the horse tied outside his door, a fine bay mare with government brands. His heart thumped painfully as he recognized it. Matthew's horse, his son, was here. Ezekiel dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride. Light flickered through the cabin's window, and smoke curled from the chimney. Matthew had made himself at home then. Taking a deep breath, Ezekiel pushed open the door. His son stood at the stove, stirring something in an iron pot. He'd grown taller since Ezekiel had seen him last, his shoulders broader in his clean surveyor's coat. But his eyes were the same. Sarah's eyes, sharp and questioning. Matthew. Ezekiel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Father. Matthew's tone was cool, formal. Denver office sent me to investigate reports of ground disturbance following the earthquake. Thought I'd find you here. The space between them felt wider than the few feet of wooden floor. 5 years of distance, of letters unopened and visits avoided, hung heavy in the air. Ezekiel moved to the wash basin, buying time by cleaning his hands and face. Made bean soup, Matthew said after a moment. There's plenty. Much obliged. Ezekiel dried his hands on a rough towel. You've grown? People tend to do that in 5 years. The rebuke stung, but Ezekiel couldn't deny he deserved it. After Sarah died, he'd withdrawn into himself, leaving Matthew to navigate his grief alone. By the time Ezekiel emerged from his fog of mourning, his son had taken the surveyor's job in Denver, putting mountains between them. They ate in silence at first, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Matthew had always been a good cook, like his mother. The soup was better than Ezekiel's usual fare. There's something you should know, Ezekiel said finally, setting down his spoon, about what I found after the earthquake. Matthew looked up, his expression guarded. The ground displacement? More than that. Ezekiel pushed back from the table, crossed to the loose floorboard, and retrieved the oilskin package of documents. Found these in a hidden tunnel. Reckon you ought to see them, being a government man. He laid the papers carefully on the table, watching his son's face as Matthew began to read. The surveyor's expression shifted from professional interest to concern, then to something darker as he recognized the implications. These are genuine, Matthew said finally, touching one of the official seals. These would invalidate half the railroad's current water claims, and the land grants they're planning. He looked up sharply. Does anyone else know about these, Reverend Carter and an Apache widow named Nayeli who's been helping me understand the markings. Ezekiel met his son's gaze steadily. Planning to take them to Judge Albright. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, Sarah's gesture when she was troubled. This will cause an uproar. Thorne's men have already been pressuring the survey office about water rights if these documents surface. He trailed off, shaking his head. Got to do what's right, Ezekiel said quietly. Right? Matthew's voice rose slightly. Like you did what was right after Mother died? Shutting yourself away? Leaving me to handle everything alone? The words hit like physical blows, but Ezekiel forced himself to stay calm. I was wrong then. Failed you badly. But this is a chance to do something that matters, something your mother would have believed in. Matthew stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. Don't talk about what she would have wanted. You don't have that right anymore. He stopped at the window, staring out into the gathering darkness. I need to see this tunnel myself, officially document everything before decisions are made. We can ride out in the morning, Ezekiel offered, first light. His son nodded stiffly, still not looking at him. I'll sleep in the barn. Matthew, Ezekiel started, then stopped. What could he say to bridge 5 years of silence? There's a proper bed in the back room, clean sheets. It's yours if you want it. For a moment, Matthew's shoulders tensed and Ezekiel thought he would refuse. Then they slumped slightly. Fine, but I need to write some notes first. Official business. Ezekiel nodded, understanding the need for space. He banked the fire and laid out clean blankets, then retreated to his own narrow bed. Through the thin wall, he could hear Matthew moving around, the scratch of his pencil on paper. Sleep was long in coming. Ezekiel lay awake, listening to the familiar night sounds, crickets chirping, an owl calling, the occasional stamp of horses in the barn. Somewhere in the darkness, his son was wrestling with duty and blood ties, just as Ezekiel wrestled with regret and hope. Tomorrow they would examine the tunnel together, father and son united by circumstance, if not yet by forgiveness. But for now, Doubt shadowed both their hearts as they lay in uneasy silence, separated by a wall of wood and years of unspoken words. The night deepened, and still sleep eluded them both. Each man lay thinking of what morning would bring, of choices made and choices yet to come, of a mother and wife whose absence had carved such different wounds in their hearts. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that echoed off the mountains and faded into darkness. Dawn had not yet touched the eastern sky when Ezekiel and Matthew saddled their horses. The morning air bit cold and sharp, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Neither man had slept well, and they worked in silence, tightening cinches and checking stirrups by lantern light. The horses' hooves crunched on frozen grass as they rode toward the ridge. Stars still glittered overhead, though they were beginning to fade as night gave way to the first hint of morning. Ezekiel led the way, his old mare sure-footed on the familiar trail. Matthew followed on his bay, the government-issue saddle creaking with each step. "It's just ahead," Ezekiel said, reining in beside a stand of scrub pine. "We'll need to go on foot from here." They dismounted and ground-tied the horses. Ezekiel lifted his lantern, its yellow light catching the rough edges of the fissure that split the earth. Matthew crouched beside it, running his hand along the fractured rock. "Significant displacement," he murmured, falling into his surveyor's habits. "The earthquake must have been stronger up here than in town." Ezekiel waited while his son examined the ground with professional interest. Finally, Matthew straightened and nodded. "Show me this tunnel of yours." The opening was tight, requiring them to squeeze through sideways. Ezekiel went first, holding the lantern ahead to light their way. The timbered walls creaked softly as they made their way deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of old wood and mineral-rich soil. "Watch your head here," Ezekiel warned as they reached a low spot. "Opens up again just ahead." The tunnel widened into the chamber where Ezekiel had found the crates. Matthew's eyes widened slightly as the lantern light revealed the neat stacks of wooden boxes, still wrapped in their protective oilcloth. "Here." Ezekiel set the lantern on a flat rock and carefully lifted the lid of the nearest crate. "See for yourself." Matthew knelt beside the box, his movements precise and methodical as he examined the contents. He lifted out one of the leather-bound documents, holding it close to the light. His fingers traced the raised seal, tested the age of the leather. "These military signatures," he said slowly. "Colonel Harrison, Major Whitman. These men were key figures in the original treaty negotiations." He looked up at his father. "Where exactly did you say you found these?" "Right where you're kneeling," Ezekiel replied, "stacked neat as you please, like someone meant to come back for them." Matthew returned to his examination, pulling out more papers. His professional detachment began to crack as he read through the documents. These water rights, the boundary markers. "Father, these would completely invalidate the railroad's current claims. Their entire expansion plan depends on controlling that river." "Reckon that's why they disappeared in the first place," Ezekiel said quietly. Before Matthew could respond, a sound filtered down from above. Voices, and the crack of branches under heavy boots. Both men froze, listening intently. "Must be around here somewhere," a gruff voice said. "Thorne wants every inch of this ridge checked." Matthew's face went pale. "Thorne's men, they're searching for the tunnel." Ezekiel was already moving, lifting the crates. "Help me get these deeper in," he whispered. "There's a side chamber about 20 feet back." They worked quickly, carrying the precious boxes deeper into the darkness. The voices above grew louder, accompanied by the sound of stones being kicked aside. Matthew led the way back to the entrance, gathering armfuls of dead brush to cover the opening, while Ezekiel made sure no traces remained inside. They barely finished concealing the entrance when heavy footsteps passed directly overhead. Both men pressed themselves against the tunnel wall, hardly daring to breathe. Dirt sifted down through cracks in the timbers as the searchers moved back and forth. "Nothing here but rabbit holes," one voice called. "Let's check the next ridge." The footsteps gradually moved away. Ezekiel and Matthew waited several long minutes before relaxing slightly. The lantern had been extinguished, leaving them in complete darkness. "We need to get out of here," Matthew whispered, "before they circle back." They made their way carefully to the entrance and squeezed through, staying low as they moved toward the horses. The sky had lightened to pearl gray, though the sun had not yet crested the mountains. They mounted quickly and took a circuitous route back to the cabin, watching carefully for any sign of pursuit. The morning passed tensely. Matthew paced the cabin, making detailed notes in his surveyor's journal, while Ezekiel kept watch from the window. Neither man spoke much, both understanding the gravity of what they'd confirmed in the tunnel. It was late afternoon when Nayeli appeared at the edge of the trees. She moved like a shadow, approaching the cabin with careful steps. Ezekiel met her at the door, while Matthew watched curiously from inside. "Trouble's coming," she said without preamble. "The elders have seen strangers near our camps, men asking questions about old treaties, about water rights." Her dark eyes were serious. "They watch the old ones thinking we don't notice, but we notice everything." Ezekiel ushered her inside, making introductions. "This is my son Matthew, the surveyor I told you about. Matthew, this is Nayeli." She acknowledged Matthew with a slight nod, her bearing proud despite the worry in her face. "The spirits are restless. Change is in the wind, but whether for good or ill, the elders cannot say." Matthew set aside his journal. "The documents we found, they could change everything for your people, but Thorn won't give up his power easily. He's already sending men to search." "We know of Thorn," Nayeli said grimly. "His railroad has poisoned 3 streams this season alone. Our children sicken from drinking bad water." The sun was setting now, painting the cabin's interior in deep shadows. Ezekiel lit the lamp and placed it on the table between them. Its warm light caught the worry in all their faces. "We need guidance," Ezekiel said quietly. "If you're willing, I'd like to pray together." Nayeli's expression softened slightly. "Your God hears the prayers of all who seek justice?" "He does," Ezekiel affirmed, "and he gives strength to those who stand for truth." Matthew shifted uncomfortably but remained silent as his father bowed his head. Nayeli closed her eyes, her hands folded in her lap. "Lord," Ezekiel began, his voice rough with emotion, "we ask for wisdom in these troubled times. Give us strength to protect what's right. Shield those who seek justice from those who'd hide it, and help us find a path through this darkness, guided by your light." "Amen." "Amen," Nayeli echoed softly. Matthew remained silent, but his expression had grown thoughtful. Outside, the gathering dusk brought its own prayers, the lonely howl of coyotes calling to each other across the hills. Shadows deepened between the trees as night crept in. The lamp's flame flickered, making their shadows dance on the cabin walls. "We should go to Judge Albright tomorrow," Matthew said finally. "Before Thorn's men find what we've hidden. The documents need to be officially recorded while we still can." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Nayeli, will you speak to your elders? We may need their testimony to support the treaties." "I will speak with them tonight," she agreed, rising gracefully. "But be careful. Thorn has eyes everywhere, and gold buys many friends." She slipped out into the darkness like a deer, silent and swift. Father and son watched through the window as she disappeared into the shadows beneath the trees. The coyotes called again, their voices carrying an edge of warning that seemed to echo the unease in their hearts. Ezekiel checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded before setting it by his bed. Matthew did the same with his service revolver, though his hands shook slightly as he checked the chambers. "Get some sleep," Ezekiel told his son. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." But sleep proved elusive for both men as the night deepened around the cabin. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what dawn would bring. Outside, shadows gathered like storm clouds, while inside, father and son lay awake, each man wrestling with duties both personal and profound. Dawn broke over the town with a golden haze, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Ezekiel stood at the weathered hitching post outside the general store, his worn boots planted firmly on the wooden sidewalk. His eyes narrowed as he read the notice freshly tacked to the community board. Public notice, petition for land survey review. Silas Thorn, Railroad Development Company. The formal language couldn't hide the truth. Thorn was making his move, using the earthquake as an excuse to challenge property lines, including Ezekiel's homestead. Matthew appeared at his father's shoulder, his surveyor's satchel hanging heavy at his side. "He's not wasting any time," he said quietly. That earthquake gave him just the opening he needed. "Reckon so," Ezekiel replied, his voice gravelly with concern. He turned as soft footsteps approached. Nayeli stood there, wrapped in a dark shawl against the morning chill. Several townspeople cast curious glances their way. It wasn't common to see an Apache woman in town. much less in the company of Ezekiel Boone and his surveyor son. "The hearing is set for 10 o'clock, Matthew said, checking his pocket watch. "Judge Albright's already inside." They crossed the street together, boots and moccasins stirring up dust. The courthouse stood 2 stories tall, its white paint peeling in the harsh mountain sun. Inside, the main room smelled of pine wood and tobacco. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching motes of dust in its beams. Judge Albright sat behind his heavy oak desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his black vest buttoned precisely. He looked up as they entered, nodding in acknowledgement. A handful of townspeople filled the wooden benches. Merchants, ranchers, and in the back corner 2 rough-looking men Ezekiel didn't recognize. Silas Thorne was already there, resplendent in his tailored suit. He stood near the judge's desk, a stack of papers in his manicured hands. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he watched them enter. "Mr. Boone," Judge Albright said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I understand you wish to contest Mr. Thorne's petition?" "Yes, Your Honor." Ezekiel removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "That earthquake didn't change any boundary lines that matter. What it did do was reveal something that's been hidden a long time." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Go on." "I've found evidence, documents that prove the land Mr. Thorne wants to claim was never his to take. Never anyone's to take, truth be told." Thorne's laugh cut through the room like a knife. "Really, Boone? And what evidence might that be?" "A treaty," Ezekiel said firmly, "official and binding with government seals, guaranteeing water and land rights to the Apache people, rights that were stolen and hidden away." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Judge Albright raised his hand for silence. "These are serious claims, Mr. Boone. Do you have this treaty with you?" "No, sir, not today, but I'm prepared to present it proper and official in 2 weeks' time, with witnesses to verify its authenticity." The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll schedule a formal hearing for 2 weeks from today. All interested parties will have the opportunity to present their evidence." He fixed Thorne with a steady gaze. "And all current property arrangements will remain unchanged until then." Thorne's smile tightened. "Of course, Your Honor, though I must point out that unsubstantiated claims about mysterious documents are hardly grounds to delay progress. The railroad's expansion plans—" "We'll wait 2 weeks," Judge Albright said firmly. "This court will reconvene on the morning of August 28th, 10 o'clock sharp." Outside the courthouse, the morning had grown warm. Ezekiel, Matthew, and Nayeli descended the wooden steps together, their boots echoing on the planks. They hadn't gone 10 paces when Thorne's voice rang out behind them. "Boone, a word, if you please." Ezekiel turned slowly. Thorne approached, his expensive boots clicking on the boardwalk. The 2 rough men from the courthouse had materialized nearby, watching with predatory interest. "I'd advise you to reconsider this foolishness," Thorne said, his voice pitched low. "Stirring up trouble over Indian affairs won't end well for anyone, especially not a lone homesteader with more principles than sense." Nayeli stiffened beside Ezekiel, but her voice remained calm. "The truth is not trouble, Mr. Thorne, unless you fear it." Thorne's eyes flickered to her, then back to Ezekiel. 2 weeks is a long time, Boone. Long enough for accidents to happen, documents to disappear, people to have, changes of heart. "Is that a threat?" Matthew stepped forward, his hand straying toward his coat. "Simply friendly advice," Thorne smiled. "From one businessman to another." He touched the brim of his hat and turned away, his hired men falling in behind him like shadows. The ride back to the homestead was tense, all 3 riders scanning the landscape for followers. The sun had passed its peak when they finally reached Ezekiel's cabin. They didn't stop there, though. Instead, they continued on to the small white church that stood in a grove of aspens. Reverend Carter met them at the door, his kind face creased with concern. Inside, the church was cool and quiet, smelling of beeswax candles and old hymnals. The Reverend led them to a trapdoor behind the pulpit, revealing stone steps leading down to the cellar. "The Lord's house has kept many secrets safe," he said softly, holding up a lantern. "This one will be guarded well." They descended into the cellar where Ezekiel carefully unwrapped the treaty documents from their oilcloth covering. The Reverend provided a sturdy wooden box with a heavy lock, and together they stored the precious papers inside. "I'll keep the key with me always," Reverend Carter promised, "and I'll be praying for all of you." Back at the cabin that evening, Ezekiel built up the fire while Matthew spread his maps across the table. Nayeli sat in Ezekiel's old rocking chair, her dark eyes thoughtful as she watched the flames dance. "We'll need witnesses," Matthew said, marking points on his map. "Respected townspeople who will stand up to Thorne's influence." "The merchant Williams might help," Ezekiel suggested. "He's no friend to the railroad, not since they drove down his shipping prices." "And Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher," Nayeli added. "She has taught many of our children. She knows our ways, our history." The fire crackled warmly as they built their plan piece by piece. Matthew's pencil scratched across paper as he made lists of names, dates, supporting documents. Ezekiel felt hope rising in his chest, not just for the treaty, but for the way his son's professional manner had softened, showing glimpses of the boy he'd once been. "We'll need to spread the word carefully," Matthew said. "Get people to the hearing without alerting Thorne's men. The Reverend can help with that. People listen to him." Nayeli nodded. "I will speak with the elders again. They will bring others who remember the old treaties, who can speak to what was promised." "And we'll trust in the truth," Ezekiel said quietly. "It's got a way of coming to light, no matter how folks try to bury it." Outside the warm circle of firelight, darkness pressed against the cabin windows. And in that darkness, unseen by those inside, two shadows crouched beneath a juniper tree. The hired guns watched the lamplight, noted who came and went, and planned their next move. One man scratched notes in a small book, while his partner cleaned his pistol with practiced care. But inside, the fire burned bright and hope burned brighter. Ezekiel looked at his son and Nayeli, their faces illuminated by the flames, and felt the rightness of their cause. The truth had been hidden too long in darkness. It was time to bring it into the light. 2 weeks, Matthew said, rolling up his maps. 2 weeks to gather our witnesses and prepare our case. 2 weeks, Nayeli echoed, her voice strong with conviction. Time enough for justice to find its way home. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers dancing up the chimney like bright prayers rising to heaven. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, they had their plan, their purpose, and most importantly, they had each other. The evening sun cast long shadows across Ezekiel's cabin floor as he and Nayeli sat at the worn kitchen table, papers spread before them. Matthew's survey equipment occupied one corner, maps and measuring tools neatly arranged. The familiar scent of coffee mingled with the sweet herbs Nayeli had brought to ward off the summer's mosquitoes. "Tell me again about the water rights," Ezekiel said, dipping his pen in ink. "We need every detail clear for the hearing." Nayeli traced her finger along the treaty's faded text. "The agreement promised our people access to the river year-round, not just for drinking, but for the sacred ceremonies that mark the seasons." Her voice carried the weight of generations. "The exact words matter less than what they stole from us." Outside, crickets began their evening chorus as Matthew returned from another day of surveying. His boots were dusty, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes held determination. "Thorne's boundary claims don't hold water," he announced, hanging his hat by the door. "That earthquake didn't shift a single survey marker." Ezekiel nodded, grateful for his son's expertise. These evening planning sessions had become a ritual over the past week, bringing an unexpected warmth to his usually quiet home. Even the lingering tension between father and son had begun to soften, like spring ice giving way to thaw. As Matthew spread his latest measurements across the table, Nayeli's expression grew distant. The lamplight cast shadows across her face as she spoke. "Perhaps you should know the full truth of what happened when they took the river from us." Both men grew still, sensing the importance of her words. "It wasn't just water they stole," she continued, her voice low but steady. "It was life itself. Without the river, our gardens withered. The herbs we used for medicine became scarce. Children grew weak from drinking stagnant water. Elders who had survived 100 summers fell ill." She touched a string of beads at her throat, a gesture Ezekiel had come to recognize as one of memory. "My grandmother was a healer. She tried to save them, but without the proper plants that grew by the river." Her voice trailed off. "We buried too many that year." Ezekiel's weathered hands gripped the edge of the table. "I used to think, well, that we settlers had no choice, that taking the land was just the way of things." He met Nayeli's eyes. "I was wrong. Dead wrong." "Understanding comes slowly," she said gently, "like water wearing away stone." Matthew cleared his throat. Speaking of water, we should check the creek tomorrow. If Thorne's men are already surveying for that dam—" A sharp knock at the door cut him off. It was Williams, the merchant, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to disturb you, Boone, but I thought you should know. Thorne's been leaning on suppliers. My prices are going up, especially for you." He shifted his weight. "I'll help where I can, but—" "I understand," Ezekiel said quietly. "Much obliged for the warning." The next morning dawned harsh and bright. Ezekiel's boots crunched on frost as he headed to the pasture for his morning chores. The sound of his mule's breakfast bray didn't greet him as usual. His heart quickened as he approached the fence line. The mule lay still in the morning light, blood dark against its gray hide. A single shot, precise and cruel. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he knelt beside the faithful animal that had helped work his land for years. Matthew found him there an hour later, digging a grave in the hard earth. Without a word, his son picked up a second shovel. They worked together under the climbing sun, their shadows growing shorter as the hole grew deeper. "I remember when you bought her," Matthew said finally, leaning on his shovel. "Mother said she was the stubbornest creature God ever made." A ghost of a smile crossed Ezekiel's face. "Your mother wasn't wrong about much." The shared memory hung between them like a bridge across years of silence. Sunday morning found the little church fuller than usual. Reverend Carter stood in his pulpit, sunlight streaming through the windows behind him. His sermon rang with quiet strength. "In times of trial," he preached, his gentle voice carrying to every corner, "we must ask ourselves, what does courage look like? Sometimes it's as quiet as speaking truth when lies would be easier. Sometimes it's as simple as standing beside our neighbors when they face injustice." His eyes moved across the congregation, meeting Ezekiel's gaze for a moment. The good book tells us that perfect love casts out fear. And what is love, if not the choice to defend what's right, no matter the cost? After the service, people lingered longer than usual, speaking in low voices. Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, stopped to squeeze Ezekiel's arm. Williams, the merchant, nodded gravely from across the yard. Small gestures, but they carried weight. That evening, Ezekiel and Matthew sat on the cabin's front steps watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. A half-empty bottle of whiskey stood between them, a rare indulgence for both. "Remember that time," Matthew said suddenly, "when I was about 12, and that mountain lion was after the chickens?" Ezekiel chuckled. "You were determined to sleep in the coop with your pa's old rifle." "Mother was furious," Matthew smiled at the memory. "But you backed me up, said a man had to protect what was his. You were braver than that old cat bargained for." They shared a genuine laugh, the first in years, and something tight in Ezekiel's chest began to loosen. "I'm sorry, son," he said after a moment. "After your mother passed, I know I wasn't there like I should have been." Matthew studied the amber liquid in his cup. "Grief does strange things to a man. Took me a long time to understand that." Before Ezekiel could respond, rapid hoofbeats approached through the gathering dusk. Nayeli appeared on her pony, her usual composure shattered. She dismounted before the horse fully stopped. "They threatened Little Wolf," she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "Thorne's men cornered my nephew behind the trading post. Said children should be careful where they walk. Accidents happen so easily." Ezekiel stood, his hands clenching into fists. "The boy, is he hurt?" "No, just frightened, but they wanted him frightened, wanted me frightened." Her dark eyes flashed. "They don't understand. Fear is not our way. Each threat only proves we're on the right path." Matthew paced the porch, his jaw tight. "We should send word to the marshal in Denver." 3 days' ride, Ezekiel said. "The hearing's in 4, not enough time?" Nayeli stood straighter, squaring her shoulders. "Then we continue as planned. But no one walks alone now, especially the children." The night wind carried the cry of a distant coyote. Ezekiel looked at his son, at Nayeli, at the land stretching dark and vast around them. They were 3 people from different worlds, yet here they stood together, bound by something stronger than fear. "We'll post watches," Ezekiel decided, "and tomorrow we'll visit more of the townspeople. Time they understood exactly what's at stake." The lamp in his window burned late that night, a small defiance against the gathering dark. Inside, they continued their preparations, their voices low, but determined. The treaty papers lay secure in the church cellar, but their truth was already loose in the world, like spring water finding its way through stone. No amount of threats could stop it now. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool, with wisps of fog clinging to the Colorado highlands. Ezekiel stood before his cabin's weathered mirror, fingers working slowly at his collar. He hadn't worn his good shirt since his wife's funeral, and the stiff fabric felt foreign against his sun-weathered neck. Through the window, he watched Matthew saddling their horses, his son's movements precise and measured. Niley would meet them in town, bringing her people's elders to witness. Everything they had worked for came down to this day. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times as Ezekiel and Matthew rode into town. Already, wagons and horses crowded the square. Townspeople gathered in knots, speaking in low voices that fell silent as the Boones passed. Some nodded in greeting, others looked away. Inside the courthouse, morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The room filled quickly. Ezekiel's heart swelled to see Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, and Williams from the Mercantile among the crowd. Even old Jim Harper, who rarely left his ranch, had come to watch. At the back of the room, Apache families stood dignified in their finest clothes, their faces solemn. Nayeli moved among them, translating in soft tones. Her dark eyes met Ezekiel's briefly, conveying strength. The room hushed as Silas Thorne entered with his entourage. Their polished boots gleamed, and watch chains glinted at their vests. Thorne's lawyer carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Ezekiel's cabin. They took their seats with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. Judge Albright entered last, his black robes sweeping as he mounted the bench. Though his face remained neutral, Ezekiel noticed the judge's fingers drumming against his gavel, a sign of tension. This hearing, Albright announced, his voice filling the room, concerns land and water rights in Light Creek Valley, following recent geological disturbances. Mr. Boone, you may present your evidence. Ezekiel rose slowly, aware of every creak in the floorboards. He had practiced this moment countless times, but his throat felt dry as sand. Then he caught sight of Matthew's encouraging nod, and words came. Your Honor, he began, his voice growing steadier. What I found in that earthquake-opened tunnel wasn't just paper and ink. It was truth, buried, but not dead. Truth that could heal old wounds and right ancient wrongs. He lifted the treaty carefully from its oilskin wrapping. The courthouse fell so silent he could hear the telegraph clicking from the railroad office next door. This document, signed by United States Army officers and Apache leaders, guarantees water rights that were never honored. Rights that would prevent the damming of waters vital to both native peoples and settlers alike. As Ezekiel read key passages, his weathered finger tracing each line, the crowd leaned forward. Even Thorne's men shifted uncomfortably when he described finding the hidden crates, the careful way the truth had been sealed away from light. When Nayeli rose to testify, her quiet dignity commanded attention. She spoke of her people's connection to the land, of medicines that grew by the river's edge, of ceremonies performed where waters met earth. Her voice never wavered even when describing the deaths that followed the water's theft. My grandfather's beadwork belt was among the items hidden, she said, holding up the intricate piece. He wore it when signing this treaty. Its presence proves these documents are no forgery. Matthew's testimony came next, laden with the weight of his official position. He explained how the treaty's boundaries aligned perfectly with original survey markers, how the paper's age and seals matched government records exactly. As a sworn agent of the Territorial Survey Office, he concluded, I stake my professional reputation on this document's authenticity. A murmur of support rippled through the crowd. Judge Albright leaned forward, studying the treaty through his spectacles with careful attention. For a moment, hope fluttered in Ezekiel's chest like a wild bird. Then Thorne stood, his expensive coat rustling. Your Honor, this touching performance neglects certain realities. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Progress cannot be held hostage by convenient discoveries. The railroad's expansion brings prosperity to all, even to those who resist civilization's advance. He gestured dismissively toward the Apache families. These alleged rights, even if genuine, were superseded by subsequent agreements, and evidence found in suspicious circumstances, presented by a homesteader who stands to gain. He let the implication hang. I remind the court, Thorne's lawyer added smoothly, that missing documents can be easily replaced. Authenticity is such a delicate matter. The judge called a recess until evening, needing time to consider. As people filed out, Thorne shouldered past Ezekiel, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Listen careful, Boone. Before I let some savage's claim destroy everything I've built, I'll burn every church and cabin in this valley to ash. Your choice if folks get hurt in the process." Ezekiel's hands clenched, but Matthew's steady presence beside him kept him still. They watched Thorne stride away, his men falling in behind him like well-trained hounds. The sun was setting when they returned to Ezekiel's cabin, painting the mountains in fierce oranges and reds. Nayeli arrived shortly after, bringing fresh cornbread wrapped in cloth. The simple supper of beans and bread tasted like a feast after the day's tension. "Whatever comes," Nayeli said, breaking her bread, "truth has been spoken aloud. My people heard it. The town heard it. That cannot be buried again." Matthew nodded, passing the bean pot. The judge seemed moved by the evidence. Even if he's afraid of Thorne, his reputation for fairness matters to him. "The good Lord knows what's right," Ezekiel added quietly. "We've done what we could to shine light on darkness." They joined hands around the table, heads bowed in prayer. Ezekiel's voice rose and fell in the lamplit cabin, giving thanks for truth revealed and asking strength for whatever morning might bring. None of them noticed the dark figures moving through the twilight outside, the quiet splash of liquid against wood, the sharp smell of kerosene seeping through the gathering dark. Inside, the lamp burned warm and bright. The air hung rich with the scent of cornbread and coffee. For that moment at least, hope felt as solid as the cabin's sturdy walls, as real as the clasped hands around the table, as true as the prayers rising into the evening air. The first warning was the church bell, ringing wild and desperate in the night. Ezekiel jerked awake in his chair, nearly knocking over the cold coffee cup on the table beside him. Through the window, an orange glow painted the clouds against the dark sky. "Matthew," he shouted, already reaching for his coat. His son burst from the spare room, boots in hand. They rode hard toward town, the horses' hooves thundering against packed earth. The closer they got, the brighter the sky became. Then they rounded the last bend, and Ezekiel's heart stopped. The church was engulfed in flames, fire reached toward heaven from every window, dancing with demonic glee. The white steeple stood like a torch against the night sky, while sparks showered down like falling stars. Townsfolk scrambled in organized chaos. A bucket line stretched from the town well to the church steps, passing water hand to hand. Sheriff Mills directed the effort, his face streaked with soot. Women gathered at the periphery, some weeping, others praying aloud. Ezekiel and Matthew leaped from their horses, joining the line without a word. The heat seared their faces as they passed buckets, the water seeming pathetically inadequate against the inferno's fury. Steam hissed where water met flame, but the fire only roared louder. "The treaty," Matthew gasped between buckets. "It's in the cellar." Ezekiel looked toward the church doors, now wreathed in flame. Reverend Carter appeared beside them, his usually neat collar askew, face black with smoke. "I tried," the preacher coughed, "and when I saw the flames I tried to reach the cellar. But the stairs." He gestured helplessly at his singed sleeve. More townspeople arrived, adding their strength to the bucket line. Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, worked beside weather-beaten ranchers. Williams from the Mercantile hauled water despite his bad leg. Even old Jim Harper manned a pump handle, his white beard glowing orange in the firelight. But the church was beyond saving. The roof timbers crackled like rifle shots as they gave way, sending a fountain of sparks skyward. The steeple swayed, then toppled with a thunderous crash that shook the ground. A collective groan rose from the crowd. Through the long hours till dawn, they fought to contain the blaze, protecting nearby buildings from flying embers. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. Where the church had stood for 30 years, only smoking ruins remained. The blackened bell lay cracked in the ashes, its voice forever silenced. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the destruction, his clothes soaked with sweat and water, hands raw from the bucket ropes. The morning light revealed faces around him, drawn, exhausted, and haunted. Some wore expressions of defeat, others anger. A few showed fear, glancing over their shoulders as though expecting more violence. Reverend Carter knelt in the ashes, tears cutting clean tracks down his sooty face. "My fault," he whispered. "I should have protected it better. Should have kept watch." "No one could have stopped this," Matthew said, gripping the preacher's shoulder. "They meant to destroy it, no matter what." Townspeople gathered in small groups, their whispers carrying on the smoke-laden air. "Maybe it's for the best," Can't fight the railroad. What if the treaty wasn't real? Better to let sleeping dogs lie. Ezekiel's fists clenched at the murmurs of doubt. Everything they had built, all the trust and courage of recent days, seemed to be crumbling like the charred timbers around them. A commotion at the edge of the crowd drew attention. Silas Thorne approached, his boots gleaming despite the ash-covered street. Two of his men flanked him, hands resting casually on their gun belts. "A tragic accident," Thorne announced, his voice carrying across the ruined churchyard. "But perhaps the Lord works in mysterious ways. Now we can put this unfortunate business behind us and focus on progress." His smile was sharp as a knife. After all, without evidence, what is there to dispute? Matthew stepped forward, but Ezekiel caught his arm. Not here, not now. Their proof was gone, and Thorne knew it. To challenge him would only bring more violence. A sound like wounded animal drew their attention. Nayeli had arrived, her dark eyes wide with horror as she took in the destruction. She moved through the ruins as if in a trance, kneeling where the cellar steps had been. Her hands sifted through the ashes, trembling. Something glinted in the debris. She lifted it carefully. A single glass bead, scorched black but still whole. It was all that remained of her grandfather's belt, the physical link to her people's history. Ezekiel crossed to her side, ash crunching under his boots. He knelt beside her, his rough hand covering her smaller one that clutched the bead. "All lost," she whispered in a voice raw with grief. "Our proof, our hope, all ashes." "No," Ezekiel said softly, helping her to her feet. "Not all is lost. Truth burns brighter than any fire." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at his heart. He guided her away from the ruins, away from Thorne's triumphant gaze. The crowd dispersed slowly as the morning wore on. Some paused to touch the fallen church bell, as though bidding farewell to more than just a building. Reverend Carter remained among the ruins, gathering hymnal pages that the fire had only partially consumed. Ezekiel rode home with Nayeli, unwilling to leave her alone with her grief. Matthew followed, leading her horse. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was building in the west, dark clouds piling up like God's own judgment. At the cabin, Ezekiel prepared coffee while Nayeli sat silent at his table, the scorched bead cradled in her palm. Matthew paced by the window, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "We'll find another way," Matthew said finally. "There must be copies of the treaty somewhere. In Denver, maybe, or—" "No," Nayeli interrupted softly. "The papers they showed us were the originals, the only ones not destroyed when the agent's office burned 10 years ago." She set the bead on the table with infinite care. Thorne knew this, that is why he moved so quickly. Evening approached, bringing the storm with it. Matthew rode out to check on his own place, promising to return in the morning. Nayeli left soon after, despite Ezekiel's offer to stay. She needed to be with her people, to help them bear this new wound. Alone in his cabin, Ezekiel slumped in his chair. The weight of failure pressed down on him like a physical thing. Outside, the storm broke with a crack of thunder that rattled the windows. Rain lashed against the walls while wind moaned through the eaves. "Why?" he whispered into the gathering dark. "Why show us the way if not to see it through? Have you turned your face from justice?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in harsh white light. In that instant, Ezekiel caught his reflection in the window. An old man, worn and defeated, asking questions that had no answers. The storm raged on, matching his inner turmoil. Rain fell like tears while thunder rolled like funeral drums across the valley. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel sat motionless in his chair, watching hope burn away like pages in a fire. Like justice turned to ash, like truth itself consumed by flames. Rain drummed against the cabin's tin roof, a relentless rhythm that matched Ezekiel's dark mood. He lay in bed well past dawn, watching water streak down the window panes. The treaty's destruction had stolen more than evidence. It had taken his spirit with it. A sharp knock rattled the door. Ezekiel pulled the quilt higher, hoping whoever it was would leave. The knock came again, more insistent. "Pa?" Matthew's voice carried through the wood. "I'm coming in." The door creaked open, letting in a gust of damp air. Matthew stood there, rain dripping from his oilskin coat, determination set in his jaw. "Sun's been up 3 hours," he said, moving to the stove. He stirred the cold ashes, adding kindling. Time you were too. Ezekiel turned his face to the wall. No point, it's finished. Like you finished with me after Ma died, and the words struck like a physical blow. Ezekiel closed his eyes against the memory of those dark days, how he'd retreated into himself, leaving his grieving son to weather loss alone. Matthew's boots crossed the plank floor. Get up, Pa, we didn't come this far to quit now. The treaty's gone, all of it, ash and smoke, and maybe not everything. Matthew's voice held an odd note that made Ezekiel turn. His son stood at the bedside, water pooling around his boots. Remember that second chamber we saw? The one boarded up deeper in the tunnel? Ezekiel sat up slowly. He did remember. A glimpse of old planks blocking what looked like another branch of the shaft. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Nayeli entered, her shawl sodden, but her eyes bright with purpose. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle that steamed in the cool air. I brought cornbread, she said, setting it on the table, and word from the elders. She looked at Ezekiel, still in bed. They say patience reveals what haste overlooks, like rain showing tracks that dust hides. Matthew nodded. The tunnel, we never fully explored it. What if there's more? Duplicates, other crates. You're grasping at smoke, Ezekiel muttered, but he swung his legs over the bed's edge. Nayeli unwrapped the cornbread, its warm scent filling the cabin. My grandfather used to say hope is like a seed. It looks dead in winter, but spring reveals its strength. She broke off a piece, offering it to Ezekiel. Eat. Then we plan. The simple act of sharing food began to thaw something in Ezekiel's chest. He watched Matthew and Nayeli discuss possibilities, their voices rising with enthusiasm. The rain's drumbeat seemed less hollow now, more like a steady heartbeat. The storms made the ground unstable, Matthew said, spreading his surveyor's map on the table. We'll need to wait until it passes, but I can rig better supports for the tunnel entrance, make it safer to explore deeper. Nayeli traced the map's contours. My people know these ridges. There are old stories of hidden places, caves that go deep. She glanced at Ezekiel. Perhaps Providence guided your discovery for a reason. Ezekiel stood, joints creaking. The cabin felt too small suddenly, too confining for the spark of hope trying to kindle in his heart. He moved to the window, watching rain silver the pasture. Even if we find something, he paused, working moisture back into his throat. Thorn won't stop. He's already shown what lengths he'll go to. Then we be smarter, Matthew said, more careful. The law's still on our side if we can prove our case. Ezekiel turned from the window, studying his son's face. The boy he'd failed years ago had become a man of principle. Shame and pride warred in his chest. Matthew, his voice roughened, I need to say something. About your mother. About after. The cabin grew still save for rain pattering above. Nayeli quietly began gathering dishes, giving them privacy, but Matthew shook his head. Stay, he told her. You're part of this now. Ezekiel sank into his chair, hands clasped on the table. I failed you, son. Failed as a husband and father both. Your mother's death. I let it break me. Let grief turn me hollow inside. You needed your pa, and I wasn't there. Matthew's jaw worked, but he stayed silent. I've carried that shame every day since, Ezekiel continued. Watched you grow distant, knowing it was my doing. I don't expect forgiveness. Just need you to know I see my failures clear as day. The rain's rhythm filled the silence that followed. Matthew stared at his hands, shoulders tense. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. I was 17, he said. Old enough to understand grief, young enough to need guidance through it. You shut me out when I needed you most. He looked up, meeting his father's gaze. I can't give you full forgiveness. Not yet. But I see you trying now. That's something to build on. Nayeli touched both their shoulders, her presence a bridge between them. Healing comes in its own time, she said softly. Like spring after winter. The afternoon wore on, rain gradually lessening. They shared the cornbread and made stew from dried beans and salt pork. The familiar tasks of cooking brought a measure of normalcy, and conversation began to flow more easily. Matthew sketched plans for reinforcing the tunnel, while Nayeli described marks her people used to identify sacred places. Ezekiel found himself contributing, his tracker's knowledge offering insights about the ridge's layout. As evening approached, the rain finally ceased. Clouds parted, revealing a crisp, moonlit sky. Ezekiel stepped onto his porch, breathing deeply of the rain-washed air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a hopeful sound, like life stirring after storm. Matthew joined him, their shoulders nearly touching. "We'll head to the tunnel once the ground's firmer," he said. "Day after tomorrow, maybe." Ezekiel nodded, watching moonlight silver the puddles in his yard. The night felt full of possibility, like a page waiting to be turned. Inside, lamplight glowed warm through the window, where Nayeli was brewing coffee. His cabin had known too much loneliness these past years. Now it felt like shelter again, a place where hope could take root. "Whatever we find in that tunnel," Ezekiel said quietly, "I'm grateful for this, for the chance to make things right." Matthew's hand found his shoulder, squeezed once, then let go. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but like the moon emerging from storm clouds, it was light enough to see by. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in whispers of pink and gold, as 3 riders guided their horses up the rocky slope. Ezekiel led the way, his mare picking carefully over ground still soft from the recent rains. Behind him, Matthew and Nayeli followed, each leading a pack mule loaded with coils of rope, picks, and wooden support beams. The morning air held a crisp bite carrying the scent of wet sage and pine. Ezekiel's joints ached from the damp, but determination drove him forward. They had waited 2 full days after the rain, giving the ground time to settle. Now they couldn't afford to wait longer, not with Thorne's men surely watching. "Hold up," Matthew called softly, dismounting to examine the path ahead. His surveyor's eye noted how the earth had shifted. "Ground's still unstable here. We'll need to lead the animals single file." They dismounted, guiding their mounts with careful steps. The earthquake's violence showed clearly now. New cracks spider-webbed the ridge face, and loose rocks threatened to slide. When they reached the tunnel entrance, Ezekiel's heart sank. The opening had partially collapsed, debris choking the way forward. "Providence tests our resolve," he muttered, securing his horse to a sturdy pine. Nayeli touched his arm. "Or shows us who truly wants this truth found." She began unloading tools from her mule, movements precise and determined. The sun climbed higher as they worked. Matthew engineered a crude block and tackle system, using ropes to drag the larger rocks clear. Ezekiel and Nayeli attacked the packed earth with picks and shovels, the rhythm of their labor punctuated by heavy breathing and the clink of metal on stone. By mid-morning, sweat soaked their clothes despite the cool air. Mud caked their boots and hands, worked its way into every crease of clothing. The tunnel mouth gradually emerged, like a beast yawning awake. Matthew wedged support beams into place, shoring up the weakened walls. "Looks solid enough," he said finally, testing each beam with a firm shake. "But we should work quick. No telling how deep those aftershocks loosened things." Ezekiel lit 3 lanterns, passing them out. The familiar smell of coal oil mixed with the tunnel's damp earth scent. "Stay close," he warned. "Ground's treacherous, and we don't know what else might have shifted." They moved forward in a tight group, lantern light throwing their shadows large against rough-hewn walls. The main shaft seemed intact, though fallen dirt partially blocked their path in places. They passed the first chamber where Ezekiel had originally found the crates, now empty save for scattered straw and broken boards. "There," Matthew pointed ahead. "That's the blocked passage we noticed before." The old plank sealing the side chamber had weathered to gray but still held firm. Ezekiel ran his hands over them, feeling for weak spots. "Nails have rusted. Might be able to—" "Wait." Nayeli moved closer, studying the wood. "See these marks?" She traced faint lines carved into the grain. Apache signs, warning symbols, but also guidance. This was sealed deliberately by my people. Working together, they carefully pried the planks loose. Behind them, a narrow opening led into darkness. Cool air whispered out, carrying the musty scent of long-closed spaces. Matthew reinforced the new entrance with fresh timber before they proceeded. The chamber beyond opened like a secret heart within the mountain. Their lanterns revealed walls lined with rough-cut shelves, and upon them— "Sweet Jesus," Ezekiel breathed. Crates stood in neat rows, untouched by time or weather. Leather pouches hung from pegs, their beadwork still bright. Bundles wrapped in hide and cloth filled the corners. The space had been prepared with great care, every item placed with purpose. Nayeli moved forward slowly, touching things with reverent hands. The elders spoke of safe places, she whispered. Hidden caches where sacred things could wait until needed. But I never. Her voice broke. Ezekiel set his lantern down and gripped the lid of the nearest crate. It opened with a protesting creak. Inside, oilcloth packages lay precisely arranged. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the first one. "Matthew," he called hoarsely, "bring your light." The papers that emerged were crisp and clean, protected from decay by careful wrapping. Official seals stood bold against aged parchment. Matthew leaned in close, comparing them to his memory of the originals. "These are duplicates," he said, wonder in his voice. "Exact copies made at the same time as the treaties we lost. Look, the signatures match perfectly." "The elders knew," Nayeli said softly. She had opened another crate, revealing more artifacts, ceremonial pieces, carefully preserved records, items of deep cultural significance. They knew promises might be broken, papers destroyed, so they made copies, kept them safe, waiting for the right time. Tears tracked down her dust-streaked cheeks. They worked steadily through the afternoon, cataloging their discoveries. The crates held multiple copies of the treaties, each one as legally binding as those lost in the fire. Accompanying documents detailed the Apache claims in both English and native language, witnessed and sealed by territorial authorities. "This is more than we had before," Matthew said, carefully rewrapping a set of papers. "Multiple verification, no way to claim forgery. Even Thorne's lawyers can't argue away this much evidence." The sun was settling toward evening when they finally began loading the crates onto their mules. They worked quickly but carefully, aware that darkness would provide better cover for their return trip. Ezekiel insisted they reseal the chamber entrance, replacing the marked planks exactly as they had found them. "No sense advertising what else might be here," he said, driving the last nail home. "Some secrets deserve keeping." Dusk painted the ridge in purple shadows as their small caravan wound its way down. They rode scattered, not bunched together, less obvious to any watching eyes. The mules' loads were concealed under ordinary tarps, looking like typical mining supplies to casual observation. At the cabin, they unloaded their precious cargo into Ezekiel's root cellar, hiding the crates beneath sacks of potatoes and winter squash. Only then did they allow themselves to rest, gathering around Ezekiel's scarred table while he warmed beans and coffee. They ate quietly, too tired for much talk, but the silence felt comfortable. The satisfied hush of those who have accomplished something meaningful together. Their faces, though weary and dirt-smudged, held a quiet glow of hope restored. When the meal was done, Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Reckon we ought to give thanks," he said softly. They joined hands around the table, father, son, and the woman who had helped bridge their wounds. Lantern light gleamed soft on their bowed heads as Ezekiel spoke. "Lord, we thank you for your providence today, for showing us that truth can survive even when hidden, that hope ain't never truly lost if we keep faith. We ask your blessing on what's to come, and your guidance as we try to do right by all your children. Amen." "Amen," Matthew and Nayeli echoed. Their hands stayed linked for a moment longer, each drawing strength from the connection. When they finally separated, it was with the sense that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The night settled soft and deep around the cabin while inside. Three people who had begun as strangers sat in companionable quiet, bound now by shared purpose and growing trust. The treaties and artifacts rested safe below, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But the real treasure, Ezekiel reflected, watching Matthew and Nayeli talk softly by the fire, was the family that truth and justice had brought together. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as Matthew bent over Ezekiel's writing desk, carefully drafting his letter. The scratch of his pen filled the quiet room, while Ezekiel and Nayeli shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. "The examiner will need precise details," Matthew said, pausing to dip his pen in ink. "I'm documenting every seal and signature we found, along with my professional assessment as a surveyor." He glanced up at his father. "Denver won't ignore this much evidence, especially with my office backing the request." Ezekiel nodded, watching his son's sure hand move across the paper. The morning light caught Matthew's profile, reminding him painfully of his late wife. The same determined set to the jaw, the same careful attention to detail. How long before we might hear back? Nayeli asked, warming her hands around her coffee cup. Telegraph should reach Denver by nightfall, but getting an examiner assigned and out here? Matthew shook his head. Could be days, maybe a week. Bureaucracy moves slow, even with urgent matters. Then we'd best get those crates hidden better than they are now, Ezekiel said, rising from the table. Root cellar's too obvious if Thorne's men come sniffing around. They spent the next hour transferring the precious cargo to Ezekiel's barn. The grain bin stood tall against the back wall, half full of winter wheat. Working quickly, they buried the crates deep in the grain, making sure no corner showed through the golden kernels. Grain's dry enough it won't harm the papers, Ezekiel explained, smoothing the surface to hide their work. And nobody'd think to look here. By mid-morning, Matthew rode into town to send his telegraph. Ezekiel and Nayeli tended to daily chores, trying to maintain normal routines despite their heightened awareness of every distant hoofbeat or voice carried on the wind. The afternoon sun had just passed its peak when Matthew returned, his horse's flanks dark with sweat from hard riding. Thorne's men are watching the ridge, he reported grimly, swinging down from the saddle. 6 riders armed. They're not even trying to hide their presence. Nayeli's face tightened with worry. They suspect something survived the fire. Or they're making sure nothing else comes to light, Ezekiel added. He studied the distant ridgeline, though it was hidden behind the pine trees bordering his property. We can't leave those crates in the grain bin. It's too exposed if they decide to search the farm. But where? Matthew asked. The church is gone and most folks in town are too scared of Thorne to help. Reverend Carter, Nayeli suggested. He's staying in Widow Chen's old cottage while the church is rebuilt. It's isolated enough, and no one would think to look there. Ezekiel considered this. The cottage lay 2 miles outside town, tucked into a grove of cottonwoods. Carter had taken refuge there after the fire, turning the humble 2-room structure into temporary living quarters and meeting space for his scattered flock. It's risky moving everything, Matthew warned, but probably safer than leaving it here. They waited for darkness, using the remaining daylight to load Ezekiel's wagon with innocent-looking farm supplies. Hay bales, empty barrels, worn tools. As the sun set, they carefully transferred the crates from the grain bin, concealing them beneath the mundane cargo. Nayeli insisted on joining them despite the danger. My people's heritage rides with those crates, she said firmly. I won't hide while others risk themselves for it. Night had fully settled when they set out, the wagon's wheels turning quietly on the packed earth. Ezekiel drove, with Matthew riding ahead as scout and Nayeli beside him on the wagon seat. A quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by, while casting deep shadows perfect for concealment. They had covered perhaps half the distance when Matthew's horse appeared suddenly beside the wagon, moving at a walk to match their pace. Riders ahead, he whispered, 3 of them moving slow along the road. Ezekiel felt Nayeli tense beside him. The wagon's contents suddenly felt conspicuous, despite their careful camouflage. His mind raced, considering options. They couldn't turn back without drawing attention, couldn't leave the road without the wagon making noise. Pa, Matthew said softly, remember that trick you used to pull when trading? When you wanted to avoid paying toll fees? A slow smile crossed Ezekiel's weathered face. Reckon I do. He handed the reins to Nayeli. Hold these steady, just like you're doing now. Moving with deliberate care, he climbed down and loosened the wagon's left rear wheel just enough to give it wobble. Then he returned to his seat and took the reins back. When we get close, he murmured, let me do the talking. The riders' shapes gradually materialized from the darkness ahead. Even without being able to make out faces, Ezekiel recognized Wade Turner's distinctive slouch and the way Bill Hansen sat his horse like a sack of meal. Thorne's men, sure enough. The wagon's loose wheel began its performance right on cue, creating a convincing wobble that grew worse with each rotation. Ezekiel slowed the horses, muttering loudly enough to carry. Whoa there, damn wheel's acting up again. The riders drew rein, watching as the wagon limped to a stop a few yards away. Turner's hand rested casually near his holster. Evening, Boone? He called. Bit late for hauling supplies. Ain't it, though? Ezekiel agreed amiably, climbing down to inspect the wheel. Been meaning to fix this wheel all week. Finally gave out on us halfway to town. He kicked it demonstratively, making it rock. Don't suppose any of you boys would lend a hand, getting too old to wrestle with these things in the dark? The riders exchanged glances, clearly unwilling to dismount or get closer to the wagon. After an uncomfortable pause, Hansen spoke up. "Got our own business to tend to, better luck with that wheel." They moved past, horses' hooves fading into the night. Ezekiel waited until they were well away before tightening the wheel properly. "Simple problems invite simple solutions," he said quietly, climbing back up. "No one looks too hard at a broken-down wagon." The rest of their journey passed without incident. Reverend Carter was waiting at the cottage, a single candle burning in the window as they'd arranged through Matthew earlier. The minister helped them quickly unload the crates, concealing them beneath carefully removed floorboards in the cottage's main room. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Carter said, replacing the last board. "Who would have thought this humble floor would shelter such important truth?" With the precious cargo safely hidden, they gathered around Carter's small fireplace. The minister heated coffee while Nayeli, her face glowing in the firelight, began singing softly, an Apache hymn she had learned from missionaries years ago. Though Ezekiel couldn't understand the words, the melody carried peace and hope in its gentle rises and falls. He found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since this all began. Despite the danger, despite the uncertain days ahead, something felt right about this moment. Here they sat, a frontier preacher, an Apache widow, and 2 generations of Boone men, bound together by providence and purpose. Matthew caught his father's eye across the fire and gave a small nod, his own lips curved in a faint smile. The gesture carried more healing than words could have managed, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge being rebuilt between them. The hymn faded into the crackle of burning wood. Outside, crickets chirped their evening chorus while a cool breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves. For now, at least, their precious cargo rested secure, and hope had found safe harbor in this unlikely gathering of souls. Ezekiel lifted his coffee cup in a quiet toast. "To truth," he said softly, "and to those who keep faith with it." "To truth," the others echoed, their voices blending in the firelit room. 2 days after hiding the treaty papers at Reverend Carter's cottage, Ezekiel sat at his kitchen table, steam rising from his morning coffee. The newspaper Matthew had brought from town lay spread before him, its headlines announcing the imminent arrival of a federal examiner from Washington. The cabin door creaked open as Nayeli entered, her shawl dusted with early morning frost. "Word is spreading fast," she said, settling into a chair. "The examiner's train leaves Denver today." Ezekiel nodded, studying the concern in her dark eyes. "Thorne won't take this lying down." As if confirming his words, Matthew rode up to the cabin at a gallop, his horse's flanks lathered. He burst through the door, face flushed with anger. "Thorne's men are all over town," he reported, accepting the cup of coffee Nayeli offered. "They're cornering everyone who might testify, offering bribes to some, threats to others." "Who have they gotten to?" Ezekiel asked. "Baker the blacksmith took money to stay quiet. So did the Wilsons." Matthew's jaw tightened. "But they're threatening the Hendersons' livestock if they speak up. And they told Widow Chen they'd burn her laundry business." Ezekiel stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Then we'll just have to convince folks one by one. Show them doing right matters more than Thorne's threats or bribes." They spent the morning riding from homestead to homestead. At the Martinez farm, Carlos listened gravely before promising to testify about the water rights his family had lost. The Cooper sisters, though fearful, agreed to confirm they'd seen Thorne's men starting the church fire. Other visits proved harder. The Jacobsons shut their door without a word. Old Man Tucker wept as he refused them, showing the fresh grave of his best milk cow, shot through the head as a warning. By late afternoon, they had visited 12 families. 5 had pledged support, while 7 had turned them away. Ezekiel tried not to let disappointment show as they rode home in the gathering dusk. 5 honest voices are better than none," Nayeli said softly, reading his expression. "And more might find their courage when the examiner arrives," Matthew added. Back at the cabin, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The lamp cast warm shadows as Matthew cleared his throat, setting down his spoon. "Pa, there's something I need to say." He stared into his bowl for a moment before meeting his father's eyes. "When I first came here, I had other reasons besides the survey office sending me." Ezekiel waited quietly while his son gathered his thoughts. "Thorne had approached me in Denver, offered me a promotion if I'd help him secure water rights." Matthew's voice grew rough with shame. "I actually considered it. Thought maybe that's what success looked like, playing both sides, looking out for myself." What changed your mind? Ezekiel asked softly. You did. Matthew looked up, his eyes bright. Watching you stand firm for what's right, no matter the cost. It reminded me of everything Ma used to say about you. How your word was your bond. How you'd rather lose everything than compromise what you believed. He drew a shaky breath. After she died, I was so angry at how you withdrew into yourself. I thought you'd abandoned us both. But now I understand. You were carrying grief too heavy to share. And still, you never let it stop you from doing right. Ezekiel felt tears prick his eyes. I did withdraw, should have been there for you more. Your ma would have wanted... The crack of a rifle shot cut through his words. The window beside them exploded inward, showering glass across the table. Nayeli cried out as Matthew dragged her to the floor. Ezekiel dropped and crawled to the window, peering carefully into the darkness. 2 more shots rang out, splintering the window frame. In the distance, horses' hooves thundered away. Anyone hurt? Ezekiel called. We're fine, Matthew answered, helping Nayeli up. Just Thorne's men sending another message. Ezekiel stood slowly, glass crunching under his boots. He walked to the broken window and stared out into the night, his back straight and shoulders squared. Well, here's our message back, he said firmly. We're not running, not from Thorne, not from his hired guns, not from anyone. Nayeli touched his arm. They'll try again, maybe worse next time. Likely so. Ezekiel turned to face them both. But some things are worth standing for, no matter the cost. Truth is one of them. Justice is another. Matthew stepped forward and embraced his father, holding him tight. Then we'll stand together. Ezekiel's arms wrapped around his son, years of distance and hurt finally melting away. When they separated, both men's eyes were damp. We should pray, Nayeli suggested quietly. For protection, yes, but more for courage to face whatever comes. They knelt together in the lamplight, glass glinting around them like stars. Ezekiel's rough voice carried their petition heavenward, asking not for safety, but for strength to see justice done. As his words faded into silence, a long, low whistle echoed across the valley. The midnight train from Denver, right on schedule. Tomorrow it would return, bringing the Federal Examiner. Ezekiel helped Nayeli and Matthew up. Together they began sweeping up the broken glass, preparing for whatever the dawn might bring. The night wind whispered through the shattered window, carrying the train whistle's echo like a promise of approaching justice. First light comes early, Ezekiel said, setting the broom aside. Best we all get some rest. None of them mentioned posting a watch, but they arranged their bedrolls in the main room, keeping each other close. The lamp burned low as they settled in, its gentle light holding back the darkness while distant train wheels clattered toward morning. The Federal Examiner sat ramrod straight at the judge's bench, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the morning light. Every bench in the courthouse groaned under the weight of townsfolk, settlers, and Apache families standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Ezekiel approached the front, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He placed the rescued treaty papers and artifacts on the examiner's desk with reverent care. Matthew stepped forward, explaining how they discovered the hidden chamber and verified the document's authenticity with his surveyor's expertise. When Nayeli rose to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice carried clear and strong as she described the sacred river that had sustained her people for generations. The water gives life, she said, touching the beadwork belt. Without it, our children thirst, our gardens wither, our spirits dim. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even those who had stayed silent before nodded, moved by her quiet dignity. Thorne burst from his chair, waving papers and shouting about railroad contracts. He produced land deeds with suspiciously fresh ink, offering them to the examiner with a wink and a meaningful pat of his money clip. The examiner studied each document carefully, then removed his glasses. These new deeds are obvious forgeries, he declared. The Apache Treaty, however, bears every mark of authenticity. Its terms must be honored, me. The water rights belong to the Apache people. Joy exploded through the courthouse. Apache elders embraced their children while settlers cheered and pounded the benches. Thorne's face twisted with rage as he stormed toward the door, shoving people aside. This isn't over, Boone, he snarled. That evening, lantern light spilled from every window of the Boone cabin. Neighbors crowded inside bearing pies, stews, and heartfelt handshakes. Laughter mingled with prayers of thanksgiving as former adversaries shared food and fellowship, hope finally outweighing their fears. The first rays of sunlight had barely touched the hills when hoofbeats thundered toward the Boone homestead. Thorne led a gang of hired guns, their torches blazing against the pale dawn sky. Hatred twisted his face as he urged his men forward. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel and Matthew checked their rifles with grim determination. "Never thought it had come to this," Matthew said quietly, positioning himself by a window. Nayeli slipped out the back door, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. She hurried to where the elders had gathered in a circle, their prayers rising like smoke in the cool air. The riders drew closer, their torches casting wild shadows. Thorne raised his arm, ready to signal the charge, but before he could strike, a line of townspeople emerged from the trees, rifles gleaming. They formed a solid wall between Thorne's men and the Boone place. Reverend Carter stood among them, his Bible clutched in one hand and a weathered shotgun in the other. "This ends now, Thorne," he called out, his voice firm and clear. Thorne's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, counting the faces they recognized: the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, farmers and ranchers who'd finally chosen right over fear. Thorne wheeled his horse around, cursing as he spurred it toward the hills, his men scattering behind him. By noon, the marshal and his deputies had tracked Thorne down. They led him back through town in handcuffs, charging him with arson and fraud for the church fire and forged documents. That evening, Ezekiel stood before his neighbors gathered at the cabin. "Much obliged," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You all showed real courage today." The cabin glowed with warmth as they shared bowls of venison stew. The danger finally passed. Nayeli ladled out seconds while Matthew told stories that made everyone laugh. Peace settled over them like a blessing, sweet as the spring air drifting through the open windows. Weeks later, sunlight danced on the restored river's surface as settlers and Apache families gathered along its banks. Children splashed in the clear shallows, their laughter mixing with birdsong. Women from both communities laid wildflowers along the water's edge, purple and yellow petals bright against dark earth. Judge Albright stood beneath a cottonwood tree, his weathered hands holding the examiner's ruling. His voice carried across the crowd as he read the words that guaranteed fair water rights for all. "Let it be known," he declared, "that this treaty shall stand as law, binding all who come after us to honor its truth." Ezekiel watched from a small rise, Matthew on one side and Nayeli on the other. His heart swelled with gratitude at how the Lord had used a simple homesteader to restore justice. Looking at the gathered faces, Apache elders nodding solemnly, settler children playing with native youngsters, women sharing bread and stories, he saw healing taking root like spring grass after rain. "Your land borders the sweetest part of the river," he said to Nayeli and the Apache families. "But know that you're welcome to draw water from my section anytime. My well and stream are yours too." Nayeli squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears of joy. Matthew clapped his father's shoulder, pride evident in his gesture. From the newly built chapel, Reverend Carter rang the bell that had survived the fire. Its clear tone rang out across the valley, echoing off the ridges where the hidden tunnel had first revealed its secrets. The sound spoke of fresh beginnings, of old wounds mending. As twilight painted the sky in purple and gold, Ezekiel stood by the riverside. He marveled at how far he'd come from those lonely days after his wife's passing. Now reconciled with Matthew, trusted by two peoples, and holding Nayeli's hand, he felt Providence's purpose. The river flowed on, its waters carrying whispers of a story that would indeed be remembered by the nation, a tale of faith, justice, and hearts united by truth. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.